the trigger and the mind is on the plan. I got my prescription and every citizen's got his.
Hi Gringo, it's Robbie here, and I'm going to have a look at your game, my friend. But before I do that, I'm going to highlight certain plans and ideas associated with the pawn structure. Because the pawn structure determines where we put our pieces. Now, in the game it was a Sicilian Dragon which begins e4, c5. In this instance you played knight to f3, which is an excellent move because it stops black forming a pawn duo in the centre. Black played d6, knight f3, knight f6, you played d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and here black played g6, entering into what is known as the Sicilian Dragon. Now, this pawn formation has with it associated plans, and it's important for us when we are playing chess that we play strategically. We must understand what the relative plans are according to the pawn structure. And I'm just going to take these pieces off to highlight this. Excuse me. Now, if we apply the Smirnov method of looking at weak squares along the 5th and 6th ranks, especially in these centre squares here, we can see that the square d5 is essentially weak. It can never really be challenged by a pawn, because then the d6 square itself becomes really weak. So this forms the idea of some of our plans, is that we would like to occupy the d5 square with a piece. And this has a bearing, of course, on how we use our pieces. For example, if there's a knight on f6 and there's a light squared bishop on the board, if we have the idea of occupying the d5 square with a minor piece, then we of course would want to swap off the pieces that have some influence on the d5 square. And of course this has an influence on the way that we use our own pieces. For example, it's probably likely that we'd like to use our dark squared bishop to swap off this knight. And of course we might try to swap off this bishop in a similar way. So we can see how the pawn structure has a bearing on our plans, and how our plans have a bearing on the way that we use our pieces. Now, occupying the d5 square is just one plan. There are of course others. For example, we might castle kingside, and we have the idea of playing f4, f5 to attack this structure here. Again, this has a bearing on how we would use our pieces. For example, if we had a light square bishop, it's probably most likely that we would put our bishop where it has some influence along this diagonal here, because we are in fact trying to attack this complex here with f4, f5. So again, we can see how the pawn structure influences our plans and how it has an effect on where we put our pieces. And the idea is that we are creating a harmonious scheme of things. Our pawns and pieces working in harmony with our strategic aims. Now there is of course one other idea when playing against this pawn formation of black, is that to castle queenside and play f3, g4, h4 and h5, trying to attack this complex in this way. And the idea is simply to open up the h-file for a rook and to attack the castle kingside of black. Now again, this has a bearing on how we would use our pieces. For example, it's more than likely that black will have a dark square bishop on here. We would therefore of course seek to preserve our own dark square bishop, and in conjunction with the queen, if we are planning on the g4, f3, g4, h4 method of seeking to swap off this dark square bishop and then launching our pawns like this. So once again we can see how the pawn formation forms the basis of our plan, and our plan has an influence on where we put our pieces. Excuse me. So there's essentially three plans, three strategic ideas based on the pawn structure that influence how we would use our pieces. The first one being, we might seek to occupy the d5 square with a minor piece. We might castle kingside and play f4, f5. We might castle queenside, play f3, g4, h4, h5. And these are three strategic ideas inherent with regard to this specific pawn structure here of the Sicilian Dragon. So I relate this to you because you will readily discern from a consideration of these plans is that it has a bearing on how we use our pieces. Now, I know Smirnov says that we should use our pieces and principles. For example, the principle of maximum activity, which would dictate that we put a bishop, of course, on b5 and another bishop on g5. But we can see that this is not enough. Development for development's sake is simply not enough. We must develop our pieces in harmony with the respective strategic idea that we're trying to implement. And as I've already stated, if it's to simply castle kingside and play f4, f5, then this bishop here on b5 isn't really helping us that much. It would be much better if it was on this diagonal here. And the same is true, of course, if we're planning on castling queenside. A bishop on g5 is not really going to help as well. It'd be much better if it was on, say, e3, nestled in behind our pawns here, where we can exchange it off for black's dark square bishop, giving us a much better chance of having some influence and trying to open up the h-file. So this is the idea I'm trying to instill in you, Gringo, my friend. Development for development's sake is not enough. We must develop our pieces in harmony with the respective plan, strategic plan. And of course we get this from a consideration of the pawn structure. So hopefully that makes sense to you, my friend. And I mention it in respect to the game that we're about to consider, because I'll make some comments on the piece placements and it's really helpful for you to understand what it is I'm trying to relate to you. So anyhow, let's look at your game and we'll see if we can make some recommendations on this basis. Okay, the game began e4, which of course is an excellent choice, and it has behind it the idea of the principle of maximum activity. Our bishop is free, our queen is free, we have maximum activity. Black plays c5, and here you developed according to the principle of the centre and the principle of the least active piece, and played knight to c3, which is again an excellent move. Your opponent played d6, which is a fairly flexible choice, and again you played an excellent move, knight to f3. The principle of the least active piece, the principle of the centre, developing a piece towards the centre, and so far so good. Here your opponent played knight to f6, and again you played the best choice, d4. Principle of maximum activity, preparation for development, and challenging the centre, principle of the centre. She takes d4, knight takes d4, again principle of maximum activity. Your knight is of course moving forward and now controls all these very nice squares. Whoops. And everything is good. And here your opponent played g6, of course planning on putting his bishop on g7, and we enter what is known as the Sicilian Dragon. And here you played bishop b5. Now of course it prepares to castle kingside, and of course it places the bishop on a square where it has maximum activity, and of course it forces black to do something. The only problem with it is that it doesn't really fit in with plan according to the pawn structure. You can see that the position is not closed. You have a semi-open d-file, and the position may become open at some point. It would therefore be more prudent to preserve your bishop rather than trying to exchange it off. Now, it is of course different if you have a different system. Just let me show you an instance where this bishop is exchanged off in the Rossalimo Sicilian, which begins like this. And it just highlights the difference. Can go e4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, and now bishop b5. And the idea is to exchange off this knight and keep the centre closed. For example, knight f3, takes, and then d3. And all the pawns are on light squares. We've exchanged off this knight, but we're trying to keep the centre closed. and this therefore warrants us exchanging off our light squared bishop. But in the dragon, or in the game, this of course was not the case, because we had a position that had opened up. And therefore the light square bishop would have been better to have been preserved. A better square if you're casting kingside is c4. The idea of to put your bishop here on b3, castle kingside, sorry, that would have been like that, f4, f5. And this was a favourite of America's most famous grandmaster Bobby Fischer, and it's called the Sawzin attack. So this would have perhaps been a better idea than simply putting it on b5. But b5 of course was the move that was played in the game anyhow. And here your opponent played bishop d7. Wow. If he had played bishop d7, then we can see that we can have the idea of exchanging off the light square bishops and occupying the square d5 with a piece. If this was me, I would have whipped that bishop off immediately. You'd have recaptured. I'd have placed my bishop on g5. I'd have whipped that one off, and then I would have occupied d5 with a piece. If he wants to take it off, he can take it off. We'll simply recapture, and we have the strategic idea of playing against this backward e-pawn along this half-open e-file. But of course that never happened. I think you castled instead. Just let me get the position back. And this is a position here, and here you castled. And here your opponent played knight to c6. And here you played bishop to g5, of course putting the bishop on a square where it has maximum influence. But again we can see that this idea of bishop g5 would have been better if we were in a position to occupy the d5 square with a piece. Now that we've castled kingside, it doesn't really make sense for us to try and exchange off the dark square bishop, because we don't have the idea of pushing our pawns, casting queenside and pushing our pawns up the board. Our idea in this position should really have been f4, f5, trying to break up the kingside position like that. It's not necessarily a very bad move, but again it's development for development's sake, and it would have been better to try to develop with respect to a plan based of course on a consideration of the pawn structure. Here your opponent played bishop g7 and you correctly played queen to d2, developing a piece, and of course connecting your rooks. So you have excellent development, Gringo. All your pieces are developed. You've posted your queen, and you've connected your rooks, and you've completed all the ideas that one should have done with regard to the opening. Here your opponent played queen to a5, and here you retreated the knight to b3. Now, it might be argued, of course, that the knight has less influence on b3, but I think it's a really good move myself. The knight's been, of course, on d4 has been x-rayed by this bishop, and it avoids all tactical possibilities that black might have had, and it takes under control the important d4 square. So although the knight has less influence on b3, tactically it's a very good move, and of course it gains a tempo on the queen as well. And black, of course, was forced to go back, and he played queen to c7, and here you played the excellent bishop to c4. In conjunction with a plan that I outlined at the very beginning, the idea should be to play f4, f5, and attack this entire kingside complex, and of course the pieces that are defending that. Here your opponent played a5, and you stopped this idea immediately with a4. And here we see one of the drawbacks of playing knight to b3 is that your opponent can now attack your bishop here on c4. Of course, why should you let him take it without any cause? And you played your bishop back, which I think is a really good idea, to b5, threatening to swap off this light square bishop. If it was me at this point, I would whip this bishop right off the board, I would whip this knight right off the board, and I would plan a knight in there on d5 and let him worry about that. Your opponent castled, and you played rook e1. Perhaps a better idea, Gringo, would be just keep your f rook there, and of course playing rook a to e1, and then of course kicking this knight with f4. But of course that didn't happen, and you played rook to e1. And here he gains a tempo on the queen with knight to c4, forcing your queen to go back and to a somewhat passive position, defending the b2 pawn. I think a much better idea, if we could just go back a minute, Gringo, is that instead of moving your queen back into a somewhat passive position, to have simply taken this knight off. It's in our side of the board, it's invading our territory, it doesn't belong there, it's up to no good there, and we simply are best removing it. And it's based on the excellent tactical idea that if queen takes, then e5. Of course, if the pawn ever tries to take, then we simply take this knight off, black is forced to recapture, and we get a free bishop. Just let me show you. If that ever happened, then this, and we have a free bishop. So if I can just go back, After e5, black is forced to play a move like knight to e4, and then we can invade by taking it on e7, and our position is absolutely excellent for us. So this would have been a better idea than going passively back with the queen. You could have in fact had a winning position after this. Bishop takes c4 instead of queen to b1. Sorry, queen to c1 rather. After this, your opponent played rook to e8, and you tried to neutralize the knight with the c4 knight with knight to d2. After this, bishops were exchanged, and your opponent played knight to g4. And if ever there was a time to occupy the d5 square, it would have been now, with excellent knight to d5, gaining a tempo on the queen and putting pressure on this pawn here. And here you played knight takes c4, queen takes c4, and rook to a4, which is in fact, it looks forcing, but of course black has this resource against the f2 pawn, and he played of course queen to c5. This forces you of course to deal with this threat, and here black took the opportunity. Knight takes c3. Of course you're forced to recapture, and look at all the counterplay black is getting down this half open c file. He's threatening of course rook takes e8 as well, when you have no time for queen takes g4 sorry. Of course the rook is forced to move, and the knight goes back to the excellent outpost on e5. And here, Gringo, you launch into an h-pawn attack, trying to get an attack against this weakened structure here. And here black plays b6, stopping this passed pawn should at least cause him any damage. h5 was played, rook to c8, queen h4, rook c4. Rooks are of course exchanged, and this knight gets some amazing activity because of this exchange. And of course here you play bishop takes e7, which looks really good in fact, but of course it fails to the tactical shot. Queen to a1, and after the king of course is forced to move, the queen comes back with tempo, and our poor bishop here is going to be lost, which of course is a real pity, because your development was great, Gringo, at the start. What I can really suggest is just try to think in strategic terms. I mean, think of in terms of pawn structure. If we just go right back to the beginning, in this particular setup known as the Sicilian Dragon, there are essentially three plans from the perspective of white: occupying the square d5, and that of course means exchanging off the light squared bishop and the f6 knight, playing instead this way and castling queenside and trying to storm black's castle position, exchanging off dark square bishop like this, and of course the other way is playing for the f4 break, f4, f5, by castling of course kingside and pushing f4, f5. So I hope, Gringo, that this is a fairly lengthy video, but I really wanted to go into some depth and try and explain the ideas that have evolved over time, because the masters have come up with these plans. But it's a really great example of highlighting that although Smirnov in his video says that we should develop our pieces where they have the maximum influence, and it's a very good and a principle to keep in mind. It's when we're considering developing our piece, we always want to keep in mind that we're trying to create some harmony within our position, and bishops especially need to take into consideration the strategic ideas that we're trying to employ. So hopefully this is giving you a little insight into this particular formation, and I thank you very much for taking the time to have watched it. And of course, if you've got any other questions, Gringo, or thoughts or ideas, just let me know and I'll try my very best to answer them for you. So thanks again and take care, and I wish you well with your own chess. Bye bye.